Dust motes danced in the gray light, though Alistair couldn't see them. He only smelled damp wool and heard the priest's frantic quill. Reaching out, he expected the soft, rose-scented skin of a highborn bride. Instead, the fingers that slipped into his were rough, calloused, smelling of lye soap and crushed mint. In the fevered dark of that rushed ceremony, he didn't know he was binding himself to the girl who scrubbed his floors. When the bandages finally fell away, the truth would shatter them both. The master bedroom of Oakhaven smelled of sickness and stale wine. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, sealing out the damp autumn chill and the afternoon sun. Lord Alistair Montgomery preferred the dark. When the fever had taken his sight 2 years ago, leaving nothing but a milky, impenetrable fog over his dark eyes, he had ordered the manor plunged into the same gloom he lived in. Light was a mockery. He sat propped against a mountain of pillows, his breathing shallow. Sweat plastered his dark hair to his forehead. The physician had said he might not survive the week. That was why the room was crowded. He could hear them, the rustle of expensive silk, the nervous throat clearing of the magistrate, the heavy, impatient pacing of Lord Fairmont. They were here to secure a signature, to secure an inheritance. Genevieve Fairmont was to marry a dying blind duke so her family could swallow his estates the moment his heart stopped. "Bring her closer," Alistair rasped. His throat felt like cracked parchment. "Let's get this farce over with." Nora stood perfectly still in the corner by the hearth. She held a brass poker, her knuckles white. She was a maid, nothing more. Her world consisted of ash, lye soap, and the endless scrubbing of Oakhaven's oak floors. She had been commanded to keep the fire roaring for the ailing duke, told to blend into the wallpaper and keep her mouth shut. But she could see what Alistair couldn't. Genevieve Fairmont stood near the foot of the bed. She was beautiful, swathed in pale blue silk, her blonde hair perfectly coiled. But her face was twisted in absolute revulsion. She held a lace handkerchief over her nose, staring at Alistair's pale, sweat-sheened face and the cloudy dead eyes staring blindly toward the ceiling. The smell of illness, a sour mix of fever sweat, old linens, and dying embers, was too much for her. "I cannot," Genevieve whispered. The sound was barely a breath, but in the stifling quiet of the room, it was a gunshot. "Ah, Genevieve," her father hissed, grabbing her elbow. His voice was a low, brutal scrape of gravel. "You will walk to that bed and you will take his hand." "He looks like a corpse," she choked out, ripping her arm away. "He smells like rot. I won't touch him." Alistair's head snapped toward the sound. "Is there a problem, Lord Fairmont? Has your daughter lost her nerve or merely her manners?" His voice dripped with aristocratic venom, a defense mechanism honed over 2 years of helpless dependency. "Just a moment's hesitation, Your Grace," Fairmont lied smoothly. "The emotion of the day." Genevieve was already backing toward the heavy oak door. She shook her head wildly, her eyes wide with panic. Before her father could grab her again, she turned, lifted her skirts, and slipped through the doorway. The latch clicked shut with a deafening finality. Lord Fairmont stood frozen. The magistrate, an elderly man with failing hearing and thick spectacles, squinted at his ledger. "Shall we proceed? The Duke needs his rest." Fairmont's eyes darted frantically around the room. They landed on Nora. Nora felt her stomach drop. She took a step back, her worn leather boots scraping slightly against the stone hearth. Fairmont crossed the room in 3 long strides. He smelled of rich tobacco and sheer, unadulterated panic. He grabbed Nora's upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into her muscle through the thin gray wool of her dress. "Not a word," he breathed into her ear, pushing her toward the bed, "or I will see you thrown into the debtor's prison to rot with your wretched father." Nora stumbled. She caught herself on the heavy wooden bedpost. The wood was cold. "Genevieve?" Alistair asked, his voice tighter now, laced with suspicion. "Are you there?" Fairmont shoved Nora forward. Her knees hit the edge of the mattress. She was trembling. She wasn't a hero. She was 19, exhausted, and terrifyingly pragmatic. The threat of prison wasn't an empty one. Fairmont owned the local magistrate. If she ruined this, she would be destitute, or worse. She reached out. Her hand hovered over Alistair's. "Give me your hand, Genevieve," Alistair demanded. It wasn't a request. Nora swallowed the lump in her throat and let her hand fall into his. The moment skin met skin, Alistair went perfectly still. Nora's hands were rough. Years of plunging them into boiling water and caustic soap had stripped them of any softness. She had a blister forming on her index finger from chopping firewood. Alistair's brow furrowed. His thumb dragged slowly over her knuckles, feeling the calluses, the chapped skin. Nora stopped breathing. He knows, she thought. He's going to scream for the guards. But Alistair didn't say a word. In his fever-addled brain, perhaps he rationalized it. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. He gripped her hand tightly, his palm burning with fever. "The ring," the magistrate mumbled. Fairmont slapped a heavy gold band into Alistair's palm. Alistair slid it onto Nora's finger. It was cold, heavy, and far too loose. She had to curl her fingers inward to keep it from slipping off. "I, Alistair Montgomery, take thee." The vows were a blur of archaic Latin and hollow promises. Nora stared at the man in the bed. He looked pathetic. He looked terrifying. His jaw was clenched so hard she could see the muscle ticking beneath his pale skin. "Your turn, Lady Genevieve," the magistrate prompted. Nora's throat was dry. She pitched her voice low, a whisper scraped raw by the smoke of the hearth. "I, Genevieve Fairmont, take thee." Alistair tilted his head. He was listening to the timbre of her voice. Nora smelled his shaving soap, a sharp bite of lime and sandalwood underneath the sickness. She finished the vows quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Signed and witnessed," the magistrate declared, shutting his ledger with a dusty thud. Fairmont let out a long, shuddering breath. "I will take my leave to arrange the carriage, Your Grace. My daughter will remain here to tend to you." Alistair didn't answer. He was already sinking back into the pillows, the exhaustion of the short ceremony pulling him under. His grip on Nora's hand loosened, but he didn't let go. Fairmont grabbed Nora by the shoulder one last time, leaning close. "Keep the ring on. Keep your mouth shut. My daughter will return when he's dead to claim the widow's portion. Until then, you are Lady Genevieve." He left. The magistrate followed. The room plunged back into heavy silence, save for the crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of Alistair's breathing. Nora stood by the bed, her hand still trapped in the fevered grip of the blind duke. She looked down at the gold ring weighing down her rough, red finger. She had woken up a maid. She was going to sleep a duchess. And she was terrified. 3 weeks passed. Alistair did not die. In fact, the stubborn bastard began to recover. The fever broke on a rainy Tuesday. The relentless smell of sickness slowly faded from the master suite, replaced by the scent of beeswax, damp wool, and the bitter herbal tea Nora forced down his throat twice a day. Living the lie was exhausting. Nora moved into the adjoining dressing room, refusing the massive, silk-draped bed. She wore Genevieve's leftover gowns, heavy, suffocating things of velvet and stiff brocade that rustled entirely too much. She hated them. They trapped the heat and made her feel like an imposter wrapped in a tapestry. But she didn't hate the food. For the first time in her life, she ate roasted meats, thick stews, and fresh bread, claiming she was eating in her room due to exhaustion. She didn't hate the warmth of the fires she no longer had to chop the wood for. Most confusing of all, she found she didn't entirely hate Alistair. He was a difficult man, arrogant, sharp-tongued, and prone to throwing things when his frustration with his blindness overwhelmed him. But beneath the cruelty was a desperate, clawing vulnerability. He hated being handled. He hated pity. Nora gave him neither. "This soup is entirely too salty," Alistair snapped one afternoon, shoving the porcelain bowl away. It slid across the mahogany table and tipped, spilling dark brown broth onto the floor. He waited for the apology. He waited for the soft, frightened placation he expected from the high-born women he used to court. Nora didn't apologize. She calmly picked up a cloth, dropped to her knees, and wiped up the mess. The stiff velvet of her skirts pooled around her. Then don't eat it, Nora said, her voice pitched in that low, smoky register she used for Genevieve. But the cook spent 3 hours on the stock, and you need the strength if you insist on trying to walk the stairs tomorrow. Alistair went still. He turned his face toward the sound of her voice. You have a remarkably sharp tongue for a woman who nearly fainted at the sight of me 3 weeks ago. People change when they share a roof, Your Grace, Nora replied smoothly, rising to her feet. She took the bowl. Do you want bread instead, or will you throw that at the wall too? A slow, crooked smile broke across Alistair's face. It transformed him. The bitterness bled away, leaving a glimpse of the man he must have been before the dark took him. Bread will suffice. And butter. They fell into a rhythm. Nora read to him in the evenings. She struggled with the French texts, stumbling over the pronunciations. Alistair would correct her, his tone mocking but lacking real venom. In return, she guided him through the halls. She didn't hold his arm with delicate, trembling fingers. She gripped him firmly by the elbow, her calloused hands providing a solid, immovable anchor. He noticed things. Of course he did. He was blind, not stupid. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he reached out and caught her wrist. Nora froze. He slid his fingers down to her palm, tracing the rough skin at the base of her fingers. Your hands, he murmured, his thumb brushing over an old burn scar on her wrist. They aren't the hands of a lady who plays the pianoforte. They feel like they've known labor. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She smelled the sharp scent of his lime soap, felt the heat radiating from his large frame. I have taken up gardening, she lied, the excuse clumsy on her tongue. To pass the time. The dirt is grounding. Gardening, he repeated softly. He didn't sound convinced. He lifted her hand, bringing it close to his face. He inhaled deeply. You smell of lavender and something sharp. Lie? The laundress washed my shawls today, Nora said quickly, pulling her hand back. She shoved it into the folds of her velvet skirt. It lingers. Alistair was quiet for a long moment. He stared into the fire, his sightless eyes reflecting the orange flames. You're not what I expected, Genevieve. You're quiet. You don't smell of heavy perfumes. You don't flinch when I stumble. He turned his head toward her. I think I prefer this version of you. Guilt, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in Nora's mouth. She was lying to a man who trusted her, a man who was beginning to rely on her. She looked at his strong jaw, the dark hair falling over his forehead, the broad shoulders tense under his linen shirt. She liked the way he listened to her. She liked the rough bark of his laugh when she made a dry observation about the insufferable local vicar. But it wasn't hers to keep. Lord Fairmont sent a letter every week demanding updates on Alistair's health, growing increasingly furious that the Duke stubbornly refused to die. If Alistair ever regained his sight, or if Fairmont forced the issue, Nora would hang for fraud. She was playing house on the edge of a cliff. I should go check on the fires, Nora muttered, standing abruptly. Stay, Alistair said. The command was gone. It was a plea. He reached out into the empty air. Nora looked at his hand. She knew she shouldn't. She knew it would only make the inevitable fall hurt worse. But the room was cold, and he was the only warm thing in it. She stepped back and let his fingers find her arm, letting him pull her down to sit on the rug beside his chair. He rested his hand on her shoulder, his thumb gently stroking the stiff velvet. Nora closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of the logs and the steady rhythm of his breathing, wishing, for the first time, that the dark could last forever. The letter arrived on a frost-bitten morning in January. It bore a heavy wax seal from Vienna. Alistair sat at his desk, his fingers tracing the broken wax. Nora stood by the window, watching the dead branches of the oak trees scratch against the gray sky. She had read the letter to him twice. A surgeon, a specialist in ocular ailments. He claimed he had developed a new method for removing the hardened tissue over the eye, a procedure that had successfully restored sight to several soldiers. He was currently in London, willing to travel to Oakhaven for an exorbitant fee. Write to him, Alistair commanded, his voice trembling with a suppressed violent hope. "Tell him to come immediately. Tell him I will pay double his fee if he leaves tomorrow." Nora's hands were shaking as she dipped the quill into the inkwell. The scratching sound filled the room, loud as thunder. "This is it," she thought. "The end." "Are you sure, Alistair?" she asked, her voice tight. She had dropped the formal titles weeks ago, Another Dangerous Intimacy. "The letter says the procedure is agonizing, and there are risks, infection." "I would rather die on that table than live another 50 years in the dark," he snapped. Then, hearing the harshness in his own voice, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I want to see you. I want to see the woman I married." Nora flinched as if struck. She pressed the quill so hard into the parchment that the tip snapped, splattering a jagged black stain across the page. "Of course," she whispered. The surgeon arrived 10 days later. He was a brisk, sterile man who smelled entirely of alcohol, camphor, and cold copper. He took one look at Alistair's eyes, prodded him with freezing fingers, and declared the surgery viable. They performed it the next morning on the heavy dining table. Nora was barred from the room, but she didn't leave the hallway. She sat on the cold stone floor, her knees pulled to her chest. She heard the clinking of metal instruments. She smelled the sharp, nauseating stench of ether leaking from under the door. And then she heard Alistair scream. It was a guttural, tearing sound that ripped through the quiet manor. Nora clamped her hands over her ears, tears hot and fast spilling down her cheeks. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, rocking back and forth. "Run!" her mind screamed. "Pack your things and run now, while he's blind and bleeding. Run before he sees you." But she couldn't. Her legs wouldn't move. She was anchored to this house, to this lie, to him. The surgery lasted 2 hours. When the door finally opened, the surgeon emerged, rolling down his blood-spotted sleeves. "It is done," the man said, looking at Nora's pale face. "His eyes are bandaged. They must remain covered for 2 weeks. Absolute darkness. Then we shall see if the Lord has smiled upon him." Those 2 weeks were a special kind of hell. Alistair was in constant agony. He thrashed in his sleep, crying out. Nora rarely left his side. She bathed his face with cool cloths, spooned broth past his chapped lips, and held his hands to keep him from tearing at the thick linen bandages wrapped around his head. "I'm here," she would whisper, hour after hour, exhaustion hollowing out her face. "I'm right here." "Genevieve," he would groan, his fingers gripping hers with bone-crushing force. "Don't leave me in the dark." "I won't." Another lie. On the final day, the surgeon returned. The manor staff was buzzing with nervous energy. Lord Fairmont had been notified and was reportedly rushing toward Oakhaven in his carriage, eager to see if his investment was about to pay off. Nora stood by the fireplace in the master suite. She wore her usual drab gray maid's dress today. She had packed a small satchel, hidden beneath the bed in the servants' quarters. She had told herself she would slip out the back door the moment the bandages came off. Alistair sat in a straight-backed chair. The curtains were drawn tightly, leaving the room in a heavy, dim twilight to protect his sensitive eyes. The surgeon stood behind him, a small pair of shears in hand. "Keep your eyes closed until I tell you, Your Grace," the surgeon instructed. Snip. The thick fabric parted. Nora's breath hitched. She took a step backward toward the door. The brass handle pressed against her spine. The surgeon unwound the linen. It fell away, piling on the floor like dead skin. Alistair's face was pale, his eyes sunken and bruised, framed by raw red skin. "Now," the surgeon said softly. "Slowly. Open them." Alistair's eyelids fluttered. The dark lashes parted. For a long, terrifying second, he just stared straight ahead. He blinked rapidly. Tears streamed down his cheeks as his eyes reacted to the dim light. He let out a ragged, shuddering breath. "I see. Shadows," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The fire. I see the light of the fire." "Give it a moment to focus," the surgeon encouraged. Alistair turned his head. His gaze swept the room, taking in the heavy furniture, the tapestries. And then he turned toward the door, toward Nora. The blur in his vision slowly resolved. He saw the outline of a woman, but she wasn't wearing pale blue silk. She wasn't draped in velvet. She was wearing rough gray wool patched at the elbows. A stained white apron was tied around her waist. Her hair was a messy knot of dull brown, escaping its pins. Her face was pale, exhausted, and streaked with soot. Alistair frowned, leaning forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. Who? He blinked, the final dregs of the milky fog clearing from his vision. He saw the heavy gold ring hanging loosely on her chapped, red finger. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The air rushed out of the room. Nora froze, pinned to the door like a butterfly on a board. She saw the exact moment the affection in his eyes morphed into shock. Before Alistair could speak, before he could hurl the accusations that were rapidly assembling in his mind, the heavy oak door was thrown open from the hallway, slamming into Nora's shoulder and shoving her aside. A rush of heavy rose perfume flooded the room. Lady Genevieve Fairmont swept in, clad in an immaculate emerald riding habit, her golden hair practically glowing in the dim light. She bypassed Nora without a glance, her eyes fixed on the man in the chair. "Alistair!" Genevieve cried, throwing herself to her knees beside him, clasping his rigid hands in her soft, manicured ones. "Oh, my darling husband! My father sent word. Is it true? Can you see me?" Alistair sat frozen. He looked down at the beautiful, fragrant aristocrat kneeling at his feet. Then, slowly, his dark eyes lifted over Genevieve's blonde head to meet Nora's terrified gaze. The silence in the room was deafening. Alistair looked at the delicate, unblemished hands holding his. He remembered the rough calluses that had anchored him in the dark. He smelled the suffocating roses. He remembered the sharp scent of lye and lavender. His jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained as a cold, terrifying fury washed over his features. He stared directly at Nora, his eyes burning with betrayal. "Yes," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet whisper that made the hair on the back of Nora's neck stand up. "I can see perfectly." The rose perfume was a physical assault. It coated the back of Alistair's throat, thick and cloying, entirely erasing the sharp, clean scent of lye and lavender he had grown accustomed to. Genevieve squeezed his hands. Her palms were damp with nervous sweat, her skin impossibly soft, devoid of the familiar calluses that had guided him through the dark for weeks. She was a stranger. Alistair looked from the golden-haired aristocrat weeping theatrical tears at his knees to the pale, trembling maid pressed flat against the heavy oak door. The maid's eyes were wide, the color of bruised storm clouds. She was breathing so fast her coarse linen collar fluttered, and on her left hand, curled into a tight defensive fist, the heavy gold Montgomery signet ring caught the dim light of the hearth. His chest tightened. A cold, suffocating rage expanded in his ribs. He had bared his soul to this creature. He had confessed his fears, laughed at her dry remarks, leaned his weight on her shoulders. He had thought he was domesticating a highborn shrew. Instead, he had been handled by a servant acting out a pantomime. "My lord?" Genevieve whispered, her voice a high, reedy soprano. It lacked the gravel. It lacked the smoke. "Say something. Please." Alistair slowly pulled his hands free from Genevieve's grip. The surgeon, oblivious to the silent earthquake in the room, stepped forward. "You must not strain them, Your Grace. The light is still a shock to the optic nerve." Alistair didn't blink. His eyes burned, the edges of his vision watering and blurring, but he refused to look away from the maid. "You," Alistair said. His voice was a flat, dead thing. Nora flinched. She swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. "Fetch my valet," Alistair ordered, the aristocratic sneer returning to his face with practiced ease. "And tell the cook to prepare a proper dinner. My wife has finally decided to join me." Genevieve let out a watery laugh of relief, settling back on her heels. "Oh, Alistair, the journey was so difficult, the roads entirely washed out. Go!" Alistair snapped, his eyes drilling into Nora. "What are you standing there for, girl? Are you deaf as well as stupid?" The insult landed exactly as he intended. Nora's chin jerked up. For a fraction of a second, the terrified girl vanished, replaced by the pragmatic, sharp-tongued woman who had scolded him for throwing his soup. Her jaw set. She dropped a clumsy, mocking curtsy. "Right away, Your Grace," Nora said. The smoky timbre of her voice echoed in the quiet room. Genevieve froze, her head whipping around to stare at the departing maid, recognizing the absolute danger in that sound. Nora slipped through the door and pulled it shut behind her. The moment the latch clicked, her knees gave out. She slumped against the corridor wall, the rough plaster scratching through her thin wool dress. Her heart was beating so violently it made her teeth ache. She shoved her hand into her apron pocket and violently wrenched the heavy gold ring off her finger. It scraped her knuckle raw, leaving a vivid red indentation in the flesh. She dropped the ring into the deep pocket of her apron as if it were a burning coal. He knew. The look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was disgust. Nora pushed herself off the wall and ran. She didn't go to the valet, and she didn't go to the cook. She bolted down the narrow, unlit servant stairs, her boots clattering against the wood, until she reached the frigid damp of the scullery. She grabbed a bucket of freezing water from the pump and plunged her face into it, gasping against the shock. She had to leave. Tonight. If Fairmont found out the deception was broken, he would have her thrown in the local jail before dawn. If Alistair didn't have her flogged first. Upstairs, Alistair squeezed his newly healed eyes shut against the throbbing headache building behind his temples. The darkness was back, but this time it was a choice. "Alistair?" Genevieve murmured, placing a delicate hand on his knee. He shuddered at the touch. It felt like spiders. "Do not coddle me, Genevieve," he rasped, opening his eyes to glare at her. "I'm recovering from surgery, not a delicate fainting spell. Go change for dinner." Genevieve scrambled backward, her painted smile faltering. "Yes, of course, my lord." As she hurried from the room, Alistair stared at the empty space by the door where the maid had stood. His jaw ached from clenching it. He wanted to summon the guards. He wanted to drag Fairmont into the courtyard and shoot him. But mostly, he wanted to corner that soot-stained girl and shake her until she explained how she could mimic a wife so perfectly while stealing his pride. He wouldn't cast her out. Not yet. That was too easy. He was going to make them both pay. 3 days passed. The manor of Oakhaven was transformed. Heavy curtains were ripped back, allowing the harsh, blinding winter sunlight to scour the dusty corridors. Alistair wore dark, smoked glass spectacles to shield his healing eyes, pacing the halls like a caged panther. Lord Fairmont had arrived, bloated with self-satisfaction and cheap brandy. He strutted through the drawing rooms, loudly praising the surgeon and eyeing the Montgomery silver. Nora hadn't run. She had tried. The night of the surgery, she had packed her small canvas bag and crept to the kitchen door, only to find 2 of Alistair's personal guards blocking the exit. "The Duke's orders," one had grunted, heavily armed and immovable. "No staff leaves the grounds." She was a prisoner. Forced back into her coarse gray dress, she was assigned to serve the dining room. It was a calculated, vicious punishment. Dinner on the 3rd night was a suffocating affair. The dining table was a sprawling expanse of mahogany, gleaming under the light of 3 dozen tallow candles. Alistair sat at the head, shadows pooling in the hollows of his face behind the smoked glass. Genevieve sat to his right, wearing a gown of crushed peach silk. Lord Fairmont sat to his left, attacking a roasted pheasant with greasy enthusiasm. Nora stood by the sideboard, a heavy silver wine pitcher cutting into her palm. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. "A toast," Fairmont boomed, raising a crystal goblet, "to the miraculous recovery of the Duke and to the enduring bond of marriage." Alistair slowly turned his head. The smoked lenses reflected the candlelight, making him look demonic. "Indeed, to marriage. A union built on trust and absolute honesty." Genevieve giggled nervously, sipping her wine. "You have been so quiet since your return, my dear," Alistair drawled, leaning back in his heavy carved chair. It's a stark contrast to your behavior these past weeks. You were so opinionated when we were alone in the dark." Genevieve shot a panicked look at her father. The shock of your recovery, Alistair. It has left me breathless." "Has it?" Alistair tapped a silver fork against the table. Clink, clink. "You weren't breathless when you berated me for my table manners, or when you read to me." He tilted his head. "Speaking of which, we never finished the Montaigne essays, the French text. You were struggling so charmingly with the pronunciation." Fairmont stopped chewing. Nora gripped the handle of the wine pitcher so hard her fingers went numb. She stared at a knot in the wooden floorboards. "Oh," Genevieve stammered, her pale skin flushing a blotchy red. I was out of practice, my lord." "Read a passage for me now," Alistair commanded softly. It wasn't a request. At the dinner table, Genevieve balked. "Alistair, surely—" "Read it." Alistair snapped his fingers. Without looking up, he pointed toward the sideboard. "Maid, fetch the book from the library, the green leather-bound volume on my desk." Nora's lungs seized. She stepped forward, her heavy boots loud against the floor. "Yes, Your Grace." She returned a minute later, the worn leather book heavy in her hands. She approached Genevieve's chair. As she handed the book over, Alistair reached out and clamped his hand over Nora's wrist. Nora gasped, dropping the book. It hit the table with a loud smack. Alistair's grip was iron. His thumb pressed into the rough, chapped skin of her wrist, right over the raised burn scar. He didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on Genevieve. But his thumb traced the scar, a damning, tactile memory. "Read, Genevieve," he repeated, releasing Nora's wrist with a dismissive shove. Nora stumbled back to the sideboard, rubbing her arm, her heart hammering wildly. Genevieve picked up the book with shaking hands. She opened it at random. She cleared her throat. And then she began to read. Her French was flawless. It was the polished, rhythmic, perfectly accented French of a girl who had been tutored by expensive governesses since she was 4 years old. There was no hesitation, no clumsy stumbling over the vowels, no heavy, smoky voice butchering the syntax. The silence in the dining room grew thick, poisonous. Genevieve stopped reading, realizing too late the trap she had walked into. She looked up, her blue eyes wide with terror. Fairmont was staring at his plate, a vein throbbing in his thick neck. Alistair smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow thing. He slowly removed his smoked spectacles, setting them on the table. His eyes, still slightly bloodshot, were brutally sharp. "Immaculate," Alistair whispered. "You must have suffered a miraculous recovery of your own, my dear. Your accent is completely cured." "Alistair, I can explain," Genevieve started, her voice shrill. "Do not insult my intelligence," Alistair interrupted, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I spent 3 weeks in the dark. I learned the sound of my wife's breathing. I learned the heavy, dragging step of her walk. I learned the exact rough texture of her hands." He slowly turned his gaze from Genevieve to the sideboard. He locked eyes with Nora. The sheer intensity of his stare pinned her to the wall. "I know exactly who I was speaking to," Alistair said, his voice laced with disgust. "The only question I have left is whether Lord Fairmont paid his scullery maid to play the Duchess, or if the whore simply saw an opportunity to steal a title from a blind man." Nora's head snapped up. The fear evaporated, replaced by a sudden, blinding flash of white-hot anger. The insult punched through her exhaustion. Alistair saw the shift in her posture. He saw her chin lift, saw the defiance ignite in her bruised gray eyes. It was the exact same defiance she had shown when he had thrown the soup. It infuriated him. She was a peasant, a liar, a fraud, and yet she refused to cower. "Get out," Alistair commanded, staring directly at Nora. "All of you, leave my sight." The manor was dead quiet. The grandfather clock in the main hall ticked with a heavy, metallic rhythm. 2 a.m. Nora stood in the master suite, a small iron pail of cold ash in one hand, a short bristle brush in the other. She was doing her job. The housekeeper, terrified by the Duke's explosive temper at dinner, had ordered the grate scrubbed before dawn. The master bedroom smelled of cold wood smoke and lemon oil. The massive velvet curtains were tied back, letting the pale moonlight spill across the floorboards. You missed a spot. Nora jumped, the iron pail clanging loudly against the stone hearth. Soot plumed into the air. Alistair sat in the wingback chair in the darkest corner of the room. He wore a loose linen shirt and dark trousers, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wasn't wearing his spectacles. His eyes tracked her every movement in the gloom. "I didn't hear you come in, Your Grace," Nora said, her voice tight. She dropped to her knees and began aggressively brushing the loose ash into the pail. Her hands were shaking. "I never left," Alistair said. He took a slow sip of his drink. The ice clinked against the crystal. "You are incredibly efficient, scrubbing the floors of the man you successfully defrauded. It shows a remarkable lack of shame." Nora stopped brushing. She stared at the black soot coating her knuckles. "If you are going to have me arrested, Your Grace, I prefer you just do it. I'm too tired for your games." Alistair let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He set the glass down on a side table. He stood up. He was tall, entirely too broad for the delicate furniture of the room, and the lethal grace of his movements was fully restored. He crossed the room until he stood directly over her. "Games?" he echoed softly. "You think this is a game? You stood in a church? You took my hand? You repeated holy vows?" Nora looked up at him. The moonlight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the raw red skin still healing around his eyes. "I stood in a bedroom," she corrected, her voice harsh, "while you were dying, because Lord Fairmont threatened to throw me in the debtor's prison with my father if I didn't hold your hand." Alistair frowned, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before the anger smoothed it away. "A convenient excuse. You stayed for weeks. You wore her clothes. You ate my food. You let me believe—" He stopped, his jaw clenching. He wouldn't say it. He wouldn't admit that she had made the dark bearable. "I stayed because he owned the magistrate," Nora shouted, suddenly scrambling to her feet. The brush clattered to the stone. She didn't care about propriety anymore. She was entirely out of patience and out of hope. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I enjoyed wearing those suffocating velvet gowns? You are an arrogant, miserable bastard, and keeping you from tearing your own bandages off took every ounce of strength I had." Alistair stepped forward, invading her space. He smelled of whiskey and lime soap. "You lied to me with every breath you took. I kept you alive." She fired back, refusing to back down, tilting her head back to glare up at him. "Lady Genevieve was halfway to London the moment she smelled your fever. She wouldn't touch you. If I hadn't played the part, Fairmont would have let you rot in this bed just to collect the deed. I saved your miserable life." Alistair's chest heaved. He reached out and grabbed her by the upper arms. His grip was bruising, pulling her flush against him. Nora gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to push against his chest. She felt the heavy, frantic thud of his heart beneath the thin linen of his shirt. "And the ring?" he demanded, his face inches from hers. His breath was warm against her lips. "Did you save that too? Where is it?" Nora gritted her teeth. She twisted out of his grip with a violent jerk, ignoring the pain in her shoulders. She reached deep into the pocket of her stained apron. Her fingers closed around the cold, heavy metal. She pulled the gold signet ring out and held it up between them. "I don't want your gold. I don't want your title." She threw it. The ring hit Alistair square in the chest, bounced off his shirt, and clattered sharply against the stone hearth. It rolled in a slow, wobbling circle before settling into the pile of cold gray ash. Alistair stared at the ring in the dirt. Then he looked back at Nora. He looked at her rough, red hands, the dark circles under her eyes, the defiant set of her mouth. He remembered those hands holding cool cloths to his forehead when he thought his skull was splitting open. He remembered that mouth reading Montaigne with a terrible smoky accent that somehow sounded like home. His anger, bright and burning, suddenly fractured. It didn't disappear, but it twisted into something far more dangerous, something entirely contradictory. He was furious that she wasn't a lady. and he was terrified by how deeply relieved he was that she wasn't Genevieve. Alistair took a step toward her. The air in the room felt entirely too thin. Nora backed up, her heel catching the edge of the iron pail. "Don't!" she warned, her voice losing its fire, replaced by a sudden breathless panic. He didn't listen. He closed the distance, backing her into the heavy oak mantelpiece. He reached out, but he didn't grab her arms this time. He took her left hand. His large, warm fingers wrapped around her calloused ones. He rubbed his thumb over the raw red indentation on her ring finger. The touch was electric. It was exactly how he used to hold her in the dark. Nora's breath hitched. She looked up into his dark, sighted eyes, searching for the disgust she had seen there hours ago, but the disgust was gone. In its place was a fierce, possessive hunger that made her stomach drop. "You took the vows," Alistair whispered, his voice dropping an octave, sounding rough as torn silk. He leaned down, his gaze dropping to her lips. "A mistake, perhaps. A fraud, certainly. But the paperwork was signed." Nora's heart stalled. "Alistair, I told Lord Fairmont to leave an hour ago," Alistair murmured, his thumb still stroking her bruised finger. "I told him to take his daughter and never return to Oakhaven." He stepped closer, pinning her against the wood with the heat of his body. "Because as furious as I am, little thief, you are still my wife." Nora did not swoon. She didn't melt against him or weep tears of relief into his linen shirt. Instead, she planted both her calloused hands flat against his sternum and shoved. Hard. Alistair, still recovering his strength, stumbled a half-step back. The heavy oak mantelpiece bit into Nora's shoulders as she pressed herself away from him. Her chest heaved. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed. The smell of his whiskey suddenly made her nauseous. "I am a maid. I scrubbed the pig fat off your roasting pans yesterday morning. You cannot just declare me your wife because your pride is bruised." Alistair's dark eyes narrowed. He looked at the soot smeared across his expensive shirt where her hands had pushed him. He didn't brush it off. "My pride is irrelevant. The magistrate signed the ledger. The parish records hold the vows. Legally, the woman who stood in that room is the Duchess of Oakhaven. That was you. But Fairmont will contest it. He will say I deceived the magistrate." "Let him," Alistair shot back, a cruel, sharp smile cutting across his face. "If he admits to the fraud, he admits to treason against a peer. He would swing from the gallows before the month is out. He will keep his mouth shut, and so will Genevieve. They will retreat to London and pretend this never happened." Nora rubbed her temples. Her head throbbed. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She looked at the iron pail, the bristle brush, the pile of cold ash. That was her reality. Not this cavernous room, not this dangerous, volatile man. "Why?" Nora asked. Her voice cracked, losing its defensive edge. "You looked at me 3 hours ago like I was a rat in your cellar. You hate me." Alistair stopped. The cruel smile vanished, leaving his face entirely blank. He looked down at the hearth. He slowly crouched, his linen trousers pulling tight over his thighs, and reached into the pile of ash. His fingers brushed against the gold signet ring. He picked it up. It was coated in gray dust. He stood and closed the distance between them again. This time he didn't crowd her. He held the ring out. "I was furious," Alistair said quietly. The gravel was back in his voice. "I am still furious. I hate that I was helpless. I hate that I poured my fears into the lap of a stranger who was being paid to humor me." He paused, his jaw working as he swallowed the bitter pill of his own admission. "But I don't hate you. I hated Genevieve. I hated the perfume. I hated how soft she was." He reached out and took Nora's left hand. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. "I spent 2 years in the dark," Alistair murmured. He rubbed his thumb over the knuckles of her hand, feeling the rough, chapped skin, the blister from the knife handle, the permanent stains of lye soap in the creases of her palms. "I thought I was dead. You were the first thing that felt real. You didn't coddle me. You didn't lie to me about the soup, or the stairs, or the weather. I lied about everything else," Nora whispered. Then stop lying now, Alistair demanded. He wiped the ash from the gold ring using the clean sleeve of his shirt, ruining the white linen. He pressed the cold metal against her knuckle. I don't want a highborn doll. I want the woman who threatened to let me starve if I threw my dinner. Stay. Be my wife. Nora looked at the ring. It was still too large. If she dropped her hand, it would slip off. She looked up at Alistair. His eyes were raw, bloodshot, and completely unshielded. He wasn't giving her a romantic fantasy. He was offering her a jagged, imperfect survival. She thought of the scullery, the freezing water, the gnawing ache in her lower back after 14 hours of scrubbing stone. If I stay, Nora said, her voice dropping to a low, smoky rasp, I'm not wearing her cast-off gowns. They smell like mothballs and desperation. Alistair's chest hitched. A short, rough bark of laughter escaped his throat. The tension in the room snapped, heavy and absolute. Agreed, he said. And I will not hide in the sitting room when you have guests, Nora continued, her chin lifting. If I am the Duchess, I sit at the head of the table. No one whispers behind their hands. You back me, or I walk out the front door and you can explain to the magistrate why your wife smells like pig fat. Alistair pushed the ring the rest of the way onto her finger. He curled her hand into a fist so she could hold it in place. His large hand closed entirely over hers. A deal, Alistair said. The transition was violent. The next morning, Mrs. Higgins, the formidable housekeeper of Oakhaven, walked into the breakfast room to pour the tea and dropped the silver pot. It hit the Turkish rug with a dull thud, hot amber liquid seeping into the wool. Nora sat at the right hand of the Duke. She was wearing her gray wool dress, but her hair was washed and pinned up, completely free of soot. She didn't look at the floor. She looked directly at Mrs. Higgins. Fetch a cloth, Mrs. Higgins, Alistair commanded, not glancing up from his newspaper. He was wearing his smoked glass spectacles again against the morning glare. And then instruct the kitchen that her grace prefers her eggs poached, not fried. Mrs. Higgins turned the color of old chalk. Her mouth opened, closed, and opened again. She looked at Nora, a girl she had boxed on the ears for stealing a heel of bread 3 months ago, sitting in the velvet upholstered chair. Yes, your grace, the housekeeper choked out, fleeing the room. Nora picked up a piece of toast. It felt like chewing sawdust. She's going to poison my tea by Tuesday. Let her try. I will have her hanged, Alistair said calmly, turning a page. By noon, the tailor from the village had arrived. He brought 3 assistants, bolts of heavy silk, worsted wool, and crisp cotton. Nora stood on a low wooden stool in the center of the master suite, her arms raised straight out to the sides. She felt like a prized mare at an auction. The head tailor, a thin, nervous man smelling of starch and mint, wrapped a measuring tape around her waist, pulling it tight. He mumbled a string of measurements to his assistant. The shoulders are broad, your grace, the tailor muttered to Alistair, who sat in his wingback chair watching the entire proceeding. A result of exertion. We will need to alter the standard sleeve patterns to accommodate the muscle without tearing the silk. Nora's face burned. She dropped her arms, the measuring tape falling to the floor. I have chopped wood since I was 7. If your silk cannot handle a bit of muscle, I suggest you find better silk. The tailor gasped, taking a quick step back. Alistair smiled behind his dark glasses. You heard the Duchess. Thicker thread, and no velvet. She hates the noise it makes. The clothes arrived in pieces over the next 2 weeks. Deep emerald greens, rich indigo blues, and heavy practical charcoals. No pale blues, no peach. Nora insisted on pockets in her skirts, an outrageous demand the tailor wept over, but Alistair ruthlessly enforced. Society descended upon Oakhaven like vultures smelling blood. Rumors had bled out from the Fairmont estate. The magistrate, Mr. Cole, had talked. The local gentry demanded a dinner to celebrate the Duke's restored sight. They came expecting a scandal. They came expecting to mock a terrified scullery maid dressed in stolen finery. The dining room was blinding. Alistair had ordered every candelabra lit. He sat at the head of the table, his dark eyes sharp and entirely bare. His sight had stabilized, the raw redness fading to a healthy, terrifying clarity. Nora sat opposite him at the foot of the long table. She wore a gown of dark, midnight blue silk. It had no lace, no frills, no heavy embroidery. It was severely cut, framing her pale skin and dark hair. On her left hand, the gold signet ring rested heavy. She had wrapped a tiny strip of leather around the band so it fit her finger perfectly. Lord Harrington, a bloated man with a face like a boiled ham, sat to Nora's right. He had spent the first two courses loudly discussing the breeding of hounds, shooting pointed, sneering looks at Nora. "It all comes down to the bloodline. Wouldn't you agree, Your Grace?" Harrington asked loudly, silencing the low chatter of the table. He leaned toward Nora, smelling of port wine and decay. "A mongrel can be taught to sit in a parlor, but at the end of the day, it will still dig in the dirt." The room went dead silent. The clinking of silver against porcelain stopped. Alistair's hands gripped the edge of the table. The wood groaned under the pressure. He opened his mouth to verbally eviscerate the man. But Nora caught his eye down the length of the table. She gave a microscopic shake of her head. "My fight," her eyes said. "You promised." Alistair slowly relaxed his grip. He leaned back in his chair, watching her. Nora turned to Lord Harrington. She picked up her silver wine goblet. She didn't hold it by the delicate stem. She gripped the bowl firmly with her rough, calloused fingers. "I find, Lord Harrington," Nora said, her smoky voice carrying perfectly in the quiet room, "that the dogs who dig in the dirt are the only ones capable of surviving the winter. The overbred hounds usually freeze to death the moment the fire goes out." She took a slow sip of her wine. "But perhaps you prefer a dog that looks pretty on a rug while the house burns down around it." A sharp intake of breath hissed from the vicar's wife. Harrington's boiled ham face turned a deep, mottled purple. "I beg your pardon." "You have it," Nora interrupted smoothly, setting the goblet down. "Though I suggest you apply your expertise in breeding to your own stables, my lord. Your carriage horses outside look terribly knock-kneed. I would hate for you to be stranded in the mud on your way home." Alistair let out a low, dark chuckle from the head of the table. The sound broke the tension like a hammer shattering ice. The rest of the table, terrified of the Duke's amusement, forced themselves to laugh along. Harrington stared at his plate, thoroughly gutted. Nora looked down the table. Alistair raised his glass to her, a silent, burning salute. For the first time since the bandages had fallen away, Nora felt the heavy, suffocating weight in her chest lift. She wasn't playing Genevieve. She was playing herself. And she was winning. March arrived with a violent thaw. The snow turned to thick, clinging mud. The smell of wet earth and crushed pine needles seeped through the heavy stone walls of Oakhaven. Nora stood by the tall, arched windows of the master suite, watching the rain lash against the glass. The heavy velvet curtains had been permanently removed, replaced by lighter linen drapes. She wore a simple charcoal day dress, her hands buried in the deep pockets she had demanded. A low groan sounded from the bed. Alistair was curled on his side, his face buried in a pillow. The sharp spring light reflecting off the melting snow had triggered a blinding migraine. The surgeon had warned them of this. The optic nerves, starved of light for years, would occasionally rebel against the sudden brightness. Nora walked over to the washstand. She poured cold water from the pitcher into the porcelain basin. She dipped a linen cloth into the water, wrung it out, and crossed the room. The air in the bedroom was close, smelling of damp wool, beeswax, and Alistair's familiar lime soap. She sat on the edge of the mattress. The bed creaked under her weight. Alistair didn't move, but his hand reached out blindly across the sheets, searching. Nora didn't hesitate. She caught his hand, lacing her fingers through his. His palm was burning hot. "The light?" she asked softly. "Like ground glass behind my eyes." Alistair ground out, his voice muffled by the linen pillowcase. Nora gently turned him onto his back. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, the muscles in his jaw ticking with pain. She folded the cold, damp cloth and pressed it gently over his eyes. Alistair let out a long, shuddering sigh as the cold bit into the heat of his skin. "Christ, thank you." Nora didn't pull away. She kept her hand over the cloth, her thumb resting lightly against his temple, tracing the slow, heavy thud of his pulse. They had lived in a strange, suspended animation for 2 months. They were partners. They ran the estate with a ruthless, synchronized efficiency. They dismantled the corrupt accounting of Fairmont's stewards. They fought, loudly and without restraint, over crop rotations and the hiring of new staff. But at night, Nora retired to the adjoining dressing room. They had built a fortress of practicality to ignore the terrifying, fragile thing growing between them. "Does it make you angry?" Nora asked quietly, the rain pattering against the window pane. "When the dark comes back?" Alistair was quiet for a long time. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm beneath his untucked linen shirt. "It terrifies me," he admitted, the rawness of his voice cracking the quiet of the room. "I keep waiting to wake up and find the last 2 months were a fever dream, that I'm still rotting in this bed, blind and dying." "You aren't," Nora said, her voice entirely steady. "You are too stubborn to die." Alistair's hand tightened around hers. He pulled her hand from his temple, bringing it down to his chest, right over his heart. He didn't let go. "The dark isn't empty anymore," Alistair said softly. He reached up with his free hand and pulled the damp cloth off his eyes. He didn't open them immediately. He let the dim gray light of the rainy afternoon hit his closed eyelids first. When he finally opened his eyes, they were dark, bruised with pain, but entirely focused on her. "In the dark, I couldn't see the patches on your dress," Alistair murmured, his thumb brushing over the rough, chapped skin of her knuckles. "I couldn't see the soot on your face. I only knew that when I reached out, you were the only thing that held me up. You are the only thing that holds me up now." Nora's throat tightened. The cynical defensive armor she wore like a second skin began to fracture. She tried to pull her hand back, a sudden surge of panic seizing her chest. "Alistair!" "Well, don't run," he commanded. It wasn't the arrogant bark of the Duke. It was a plea. He released her hand and reached up, his large palms cupping her face. His thumbs traced the sharp line of her jaw. "You fought Harrington. You fought the housekeeper. You fight me every single day. Do not run from this." Nora looked into his eyes. She saw the absolute terrifying sincerity in them. He wasn't looking at a maid. He wasn't looking at an aristocrat. He was just looking at her. She leaned into his touch. Her eyes fluttered shut. Alistair pulled her down. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, heavy with months of suppressed anger, fear, and a clawing, starving need. Nora's hands tangled in the collar of his shirt. She tasted the salt of his sweat and the sharp bite of lime. He tasted of ash and survival. He shifted, pulling her fully onto the bed beside him. The heavy mattress dipped. Alistair's hands moved down her back, gripping the thick, practical fabric of her charcoal dress, pulling her flush against his broad chest. His mouth was entirely demanding, erasing the last lingering ghosts of Genevieve, of Fairmont, of the lies they had built their foundation on. Nora gasped against his mouth as his hand slid to her waist, his touch radiating heat through the heavy wool. There was no delicate, trembling surrender. She kissed him back with the same raw, unpolished ferocity. She anchored herself to him, her rough hands mapping the heavy muscle of his shoulders, the scarred skin around his eyes. When they finally broke apart, the room was entirely silent save for the drumming of the rain. Nora rested her forehead against his, her breathing ragged. She looked down at their joined hands resting on the white sheets. The gold signet ring caught the gray light. It was scarred, dented from the fireplace, and entirely imperfect. "I'm still not learning French," Nora whispered, her voice shaking slightly, betraying the overwhelming swell of emotion in her chest. Alistair let out a low, breathy laugh that vibrated against her skin. He kissed the corner of her mouth, his lips lingering. "Good. I always hated the accent anyway." He pulled her closer, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed in deeply, bypassing the faint, lingering smell of the damp wool dress. Beneath it, underneath the soap and the rain, he found the exact grounding scent of lye, crushed mint, and the woman who had pulled him back from the dead. The blind Duke had made a terrible mistake. And as Nora wrapped her arms around his shoulders, holding him tight against the coming night, she knew it was the only right thing he had ever done. The truth is rarely dressed in silk. More often, it arrives covered in ash and smelling of lye soap. Alistair and Nora's journey from a fraudulent, desperate vow in the dark to a grounded, fiercely loyal partnership proves that love isn't about perfection. It is about who stays to anchor you when the light fails. If you love this deeply human, gritty romance of survival and unpolished devotion, please hit the like button. Share this story with your friends who appreciate a real, raw historical drama, and don't forget to subscribe to the video for more tales.